Senator Elizabeth Warren has been called out as her story changes, but she's standing by her narrative, and there's some new information that has come to light. And do the rich actually pay lower taxes?
Yes, they do. We're back with Will Truano, Democratic strategist, and Inez Stepman, senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Friends of the show, welcome, lady and gent.
Yes, that's right. So before we begin, we should say I addressed this controversy yesterday. There appeared to be a contradictory clip of Elizabeth Warren in 2007 in which she was talking about how she left her teaching job of her own accord. She didn't have the certificate, despite the fact that she's been on the campaign trail. She talks about how she left that job because she was visibly pregnant. She was forced out by this job. She addressed this yesterday to CBS News. She's standing by her story, saying that she knows that she was forced out the door. County records show that her employment was reapproved by the School Board of Education. There's also a newspaper article that's been highlighted to me by some Warren surrogates that shows that there appeared to be a policy somewhere around the 1970s in which once a woman is in her 5th month of pregnancy that she's been asked to leave. So there's contradictory information on both sides. I just want to present that to all viewers before we begin. I think, Will, the main thing and the reason why so many people were going to give credulity to this story was because of this the heritage scandal in the past and the sticking to the story despite the fact that so many of the facts didn't line up. Ultimately, this story aside, do you think that will be a problem for her going through the Democratic primary?
I don't. Yeah. I think, look, we were talking about this a little bit off air. Mm-hmm. I think, look, to be a politician, I am one of those.
Yes.
Personal narratives tend to have to be embedded in what you talk about. You obviously talk about the stories of Americans and what they're going through, mm-hmm. but why your motivations, why you're doing what you're doing, why you're seeking to elect people is important. And I think in that process, there's a natural kind of exaggeration that can happen that is still factual, kind of like a memoir. It's not an autobiography, but it's true at its core. And look, if in 1970, if you're going to tell me that women weren't getting fired or discouraged because of being pregnant, of course they were.
Nobody
and I'm
was
sure
saying
there's a
that.
policy. So.
Nobody was saying that. I think that what I had seized upon, and I think others was that this appeared to be another instance in which she was trying to appear special in order to further her career. And Inez, I'm still not sure that this story, regardless, I think that with the heritage matter in particular, that is very concerning. And I think it does speak to some of her character that she stuck to that for so long.
Look, I think it says more about what brings a politician cachet in our current, especially in the Democratic primary. Right. There are similar things that bring cachet in a Republican primary. I'm not going to lie about that.
Right.
But it is interesting. Are we back to the days of sort of log cabin hard cider, where that's the only thing that's important? Your identity is the most important thing. Look, I think that Elizabeth Warren does come off as disingenuous a lot of the time. She has changed her positions a lot over time. She's been progressive since she's like this round in the national eye, but her earlier positions were much more moderate, even conservative on some things. And I do think she faces that uphill battle, especially as we know that Trump in a general is going to seize on these kinds of things. And he's going, and I think this story is open to interpretation. I think her 2007 interview, she actually kind of indicates that, like many women choose to, when she was pregnant with her first child, she was thinking about staying home for a while, ultimately went back into the workforce. These are decisions that women, and why not just tell that story? I mean, that's what,
as I said yesterday,
it's what she clearly thought people wanted to hear in 2007. It's interesting to me that in 2019 she thinks people want to hear something else. That's not to speak to the veracity of it. She very well could have been forced out in the 5th month of pregnancy. That is an entirely possible scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think what is clear based on some of the contradictory records at the time and her own narrative previously is it wasn't quite as clear cut as the principal fired her and hired someone else for the job, right? But that is often the case when discrimination is involved, right? Whether it's women, whether it's people of color, it's often not as clear cut as the boss calls you in and says you're fired because you're pregnant, right? However, that is the way that she's kind of portrayed it. It does raise some questions, and I think Inez's point is well taken that whether Democrats want to talk about this or not right now, which they don't, I can promise you, there's no doubt that Trump is going to seize on all of this and make hay out of it.
And I would say bring that on. I mean, if we're going to compare his outright lies and falsities that on a regular basis, I can't even keep up with the tracker, with this type of scenario, which is illustrating a very true point in America. To your point, discrimination often is not manifested in like, hey, you're gone because you're pregnant. And And then, in fact, we know there were actually laws in the books to prohibit
That's right.
women and people of color from doing those things. So I just think let's have that debate. If even if she did exaggerate a little bit, I don't know what happened. I take her at her word. I'd rather compare those lies to that point that is illustrating a larger point that many people were suffering with.
Can I just jump in right here?
Yes.
With one really interesting thing is what kind of lies each side will propagate about their personal lives, right? I think it's really interesting that at least with the heritage story and perhaps potentially with how she's framed this story, both of these are again designed to show that she was a victim in some way, right? And it's interesting to me that the Trump lies, for the most part, are self-aggrandizing, right? He's richer. There were more people at my rally than ever before, right? I think that actually does speak to an interesting mentality difference between the two parties. What they choose to lie about and how they present themselves is actually
I do think that's a very interesting point. I attribute it less to wanting to portray as a victim and more as wanting to portray solidarity this is not specifically about Elizabeth Warren, I just want to make that clear, but when your record doesn't always add up to I've always stood in solidarity, it's easy to use your personal narrative to try to compensate for the fact that the record has not always stood up to solidarity.
And I want to point out, I was with a group of elected officials. I went to the border this weekend. We were talking about this, and one was, I won't name them, they were saying, if I meet all my colleagues, they've all been disabled, they all didn't work at, they've all been discriminated against. It is let's just be real. Politicians do this. They try to connect their personal narrative to what people are feeling. And I think, the ones that do it most effectively and authentically, we really hold up. And so I just think we need to have that concept.
So meanwhile, I want to get this in. New York Times did a new study, which comes, by the way, with an incredible graphic that you should take a look at that shows the way that tax rates on our wealthiest citizens have changed over time. And now, guys, we've made a new record. For the first time in American history, the 400 wealthiest Americans last year paid a lower total tax rate than any other income group. Congratulations, America. Way to go. Will, but this is part of when we see our politics careening from bank to bank and feeling like it's out of control and seeing that citizens have no confidence in Washington to actually address their issues. This is a part of the story, right? The wealthy have bought this town and they get their way time after time after the time to the point that if you are the wealthiest person in America, you're going to pay less taxes than the wage earner at McDonald's.
It's exactly right. And you're not only going to pay less taxes, you're going to have less time in jail. Everything's going to be better. And I think we often forget the historical trends of the marginal tax rates, right? And how, whether it's going back to Great Depression era or even going back to the 80s, where it was like a 47%, you were paying a higher rate. We have the lowest, it's around 23% for the richest Americans. And that means they're not paying in the estate tax, the corporate tax, all the things that benefit them. And there's consequences to that. You can't pay for things, it's harder. And you have, at the same time, income inequality is out of control. So then that enables the populist message on both sides to come in and say, and I think there's one that's incorrect, hey, it's this person's fault, it's the immigrant's fault, it's this person's fault that you don't have, when really it's the people at the top that'll still be rich. If you take that additional tax.
Quickly, I want to get you in here as well.
Yeah, so I think this is really about two different definitions of fairness. I don't think this is really about paying for things, and the evidence I would bring forward for that is that if we instituted a confiscatory tax, 100% tax after $200,000 in income, right? It still wouldn't pay for half of the most conservative estimates of what Democratic candidates are promising. So I actually don't think this is a story about not having enough revenue. I think it's a story of two very different definitions of fairness. I think there are a lot of Americans in this country who would look at our tax code and say, for example, the top 10% wealthiest people pay 70% of the income tax. The bottom half of Americans pay no income tax. There are other kinds of taxes, which I'm sure that Crystal is getting ready to bring in estate taxes.
That's what this is.
And also, I would add that this study is comparing us to the 1950s. It was a very special time economically for America in the fact that the entire world was collapsed except for us after World War II.
That's a good point.
So just generally, it's a very different economic situation. population.
Yeah, so we also had much higher rates of unionization, so workers had a lot more power in their workplace. But that's certainly an important.
And we had more intact families.
Those are both important points. But what I would say here is when you see these billionaires on CNBC going, "Oh my God, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders might raise my taxes," they're going to be okay. That's the bottom
Just
line
fine.
here. They're going to be all right.
$2 billion is just as good as 4.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you, guys. Tomorrow on Rising, after a controversial Supreme Court decision last term, where does the U.S. stand with gerrymandering? We're going to discuss it with author David Daly.
And host and social critic Tim Black is going to join us. We're going to break down all the latest 2020 news and preview next week's Democratic debate. As always, follow us on our many social channels. Send us your Rising questions with the hashtag RisingCubes. And of course, hit subscribe.
Hit subscribe.
Make sure you sign up. You don't want to miss anything, guys. Have a great day.